Father Altman goes Sede. Father Altman has produced a video titled Bergoglio is not the Pope. In his address, Father Altman correctly states that no churchman, not even the Pope, can change dogmatic teachings of the Catholic Church. He first quotes the dogmas of Trent regarding the necessity of a state of grace for Holy Communion and points out that those who teach the contrary are anathema and excommunicated. He thus draws the conclusion that the Pope has excommunicated himself by asserting the contrary of Trent. He says that this is, quote, an open and shut case, end quote. He asserts that non-Catholics cannot be the Pope, Lutherans, Muslims, etc. And because Bergoglio is not Catholic, therefore he is not the Pope. He then emphasizes the admonitions of our Lord against the, quote, wolves in sheep's clothing, rightly condemning the Pope and his cronies for their false doctrines. He says we can recognize the false shepherds by their fruits, which is also correct. However, he spends some time speaking of Pope Francis's corrupt appointments and liturgical abuses mixed with doctrinal errors, with a rising crescendo of grievances against this pontificate, repeating the phrase, from the moment Francis did XYZ, end quote. This crescendo gives the impression that the good priest is making an emotional appeal to prove his case, which discredits the presentation. Nevertheless, he says these grievances, quote, reveal and define the incontrovertible fact that Jorge Bergoglio is a false prophet, a false teacher who has excommunicated himself from the Catholic Church, end quote. He then quotes St. Robert Bellarmine to prove his case using the normal quotation used from On the Roman Pontiff. He then goes back to Trent, which says that we can know the heresy and who is ipso facto excommunicated. He states correctly that, quote, we are not the schismatics when we hold fast to the deposit of faith, end quote. Before we comment on the substance of Father Altman's assertions, it is important that we give credit to Father Altman for his stalwart defense of the faith against the corruption of the Pope and many bishops. Father Altman is obviously a good priest who is doing his best to defend the sheep against the wolves. And for that reason, every Catholic should be thankful to him for trying to work for the faith, since by doing this, he is doing more than the vast majority of priests out there. However, having said that, we must point out a few important things about his talk. The question of a heretical pope has not been definitively resolved. Father Altman says repeatedly, quote, don't take my word for it, end quote, and quotes St. Robert Bellarmine. But what is not included in his case is the fact that Bellarmine presents one view among a number of accepted and traditional views. The question of a heretical pope has not been definitively resolved by the magisterium. His Excellency Bishop Athanasius Schneider, for instance, published a different view than this, also based on the patristics and tradition, here at 1 Peter 5 back in 2019. The paradox between you are Peter and get behind me, Satan, has not been resolved in the tradition. Vatican I did not address important aspects of these things, leading to the dubia about the papacy, which are outlined in a different article. See the dubia of Vatican I. Because of this, it is not possible for bishops or priests, and certainly not the common faithful, to assert a particular view on this question as if it has been, one, definitively resolved, and two, adjudicated for a given case in our time now. As our contributing editor, Peter Kwasniewski, writes in his text on hyperpapalism, in the context of the Bene Plenist controversy, he says, quote, I do not believe that the ordinary faithful are competent to adjudicate when God has stripped a pope of the papal office owing to formal heresy. Side note, another aspect of this that's very important is this distinction between material and formal heresy, and only the latter is the one that strips the pope of his office, even allegedly. Continuing the quote from Kwasniewski, it is one thing to raise doubts and difficulties about Benedict XVI's abdication or Francis's apparent heresies, leaving the final determination to a future pope or ecumenical council. It is quite another to decide on one's own or as a part of a small remnant that one may cease to recognize as Pope the one who is virtually unanimously and universally recognized as Pope. End quote. That quote is from Kwasniewski's The Road from Hyperpapalism to Catholicism, Volume 1, in the preface. Therefore, since the tradition is not definitive on this question, no one can definitively judge the issue, including the case against the current Pope. So the question is, how can the Pope be both the safeguard of orthodoxy and be infallible in certain cases? Can he become a heretic or not? If he does become a heretic, what happens? The theologians and the saints have debated this for centuries, and it has not been resolved. Judging the Pope and living in ambiguity. In the text Defending the Faith Against Present Heresies, editors John Lamont and Claudio Pieranti bring together the various interventions of theologians against Pope Francis and various heresies which can be ascribed to him either directly or indirectly. This text wisely includes an additional note in the beginning, which says that, quote, the documents collected here do not attempt a moral judgment on the person of the Pope, end quote. Thus, the editors attempt to draw a distinction between, quote, the objective faults against the faith and, quote, the subjective gravity of these faults, end quote. This is the ambiguity in which we must live as Catholics. Holding fast to the deposit of faith, but realizing that our ability to judge the Pope is severely limited. We can judge what we are obliged to pass down to our children. Otherwise, we could not pass it down. But we are not obliged to pass down to our children an answer on the question of a heretical Pope, nor to judge the current Pope, since it is beyond the jurisdiction of the faithful to adjudicate these questions. The trap of sedevacantism seems to be an excessive reliance on tribunals other than the ecclesiastical hierarchy. The long-term result is a system of private remnants which cannot be united in truth by an objective, visible hierarchy. Thus, we cannot agree that the case against Pope Francis as Pope is an open and shut case. We must use caution in this matter and not go beyond what has been passed down to us by tradition. We must live in this ambiguity, but with faith that God will resolve these matters in his own time.